In today's mini tutorial, we're going to look at the neural control of arterial blood pressure, and we're going to split it up into three main sections. In the first section, we're going to revise some of the important equations describing relationships between the cardiovascular system and blood pressure, for example cardiac output, stroke volume, etc. Secondly, we're going to consider what constitutes a neural reflex, so we're going to think about reflexes in the second section. And then finally, we're going to think about the response of the cardiovascular system to a drop in arterial blood pressure. So we're going to think about responses to decreased blood pressure. And this is quite an important area to think about because it helps us to understand how the body copes with challenges such as hemorrhage. So let's revise the two equations that we've already covered so far. So the first, you might remember, is the Poiseuille relationship, where the blood flow through a pipe is proportional to the pressure difference between the two ends of the pipe multiplied by the radius of the pipe to the power 4 all over the length of the pipe. And you may recall that the take-home message from this was that very small changes in the radius can have very big changes on the flow. The second relationship that you should already be familiar with is that between cardiac output, heart rate and stroke volume. So you'll recall that cardiac output is the product of heart rate and stroke volume, and in turn stroke volume is given as the difference between the end diastolic volume of a ventricle and the end systolic volume. And that these two factors, end diastolic volume and end systolic volume, are themselves regulated by other parts of the cardiovascular system. Now, I want to introduce a final equation which is new, and this is the equation relating arterial blood pressure, so this is specifically the pressure in arteries, relating arterial blood pressure to cardiac output and a new quantity which we call total peripheral resistance. Now, total peripheral resistance is a relatively straightforward concept to understand, and it's basically the amount of resistance that the vasculature offers against the heart. So it's how much resistance the heart has to pump against to get blood out from the ventricles. And as I'm sure you'll be aware, the total peripheral resistance is very closely related to the radius of the arterioles. So it is at the level of the arterioles where the total peripheral resistance is particularly closely controlled. Wide arterioles lead to a greater amount of flow and decreased resistance to blood flow. Small arterioles lead to a smaller amount of flow and higher total peripheral resistance. So with these equations in mind, let's consider how the nervous system helps to control the cardiovascular system. Now, neurological control of the cardiovascular system is almost entirely unconscious and mediated by so-called neural reflexes. Now, all neural reflexes have the same basic components. They all have sense organs which are able to detect changes in an internal parameter. So, for example, in this case, the sense organs might be structures that detect changes in blood pressure. These sense organs then connect to sensory nerves. So sensory nerves connect to the sense organs and collect that information, transporting back to the central nervous system, which is where the processing of that information takes place. So the sensory nerves, the information carried by those is processed by the central nervous system. After processing, then we need to produce a response, and that response is mediated by motor nerves. So there are effector nerves, motor nerves, which are able to tell effector organs what to do. Okay. We're going to go through the specifics in terms of blood pressure control in the cardiovascular system right now. Now, if we're thinking about the regulation of arterial blood pressure, the major sense organ which detects the level of arterial blood pressure is the so-called carotid sinus. We're going to have a look where the carotid sinus is in a little while. But the basic idea is that this is a swelling in an artery, and within the walls of the artery at this point there are so-called baroreceptors which are sensitive to stretch. And if those baroreceptors are stretched, they will lead to an increased frequency of action potentials in the sensory nerves which innervate the carotid sinus. And in this case, the sensory nerves are the glossopharyngeal nerves. So this is a nerve which goes into the brainstem, and it's the 9th out of 12 cranial nerves, and it's called the glossopharyngeal nerve. You should read more about this in your textbook. So information concerning the level of arterial blood pressure is carried through the glossopharyngeal nerve into the central nervous system, and specifically the part of the central nervous system which deals with blood pressure and many other automatic functions, many other homeostatic functions, is known as the medulla. So this is a part of the brainstem, and it's actually the lowest part of the brainstem, directly joining on to the spinal cord. So the medulla of the brainstem is the major part of the CNS which deals with cardiovascular reflexes. So within the medulla, a certain amount of information processing takes place, leading up to action potentials in one of the motor nerves emerging from the brainstem, and this is the 10th cranial nerve, otherwise known as the vagus, which I'm sure you will have heard of. So the vagus is the major effector of the so-called parasympathetic nervous system, but in addition we can also have changes in the level of activation in the sympathetic nervous system. And as you might recall, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous systems are antagonistic, so they do tend to have different effects. With respect to the cardiovascular system, the sympathetic nervous system is typically excitatory, so it might increase blood pressure. The parasympathetic nervous system is typically inhibitory, so it would be likely to lead to decreases in blood pressure. But the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems can only exert their effects by influencing effector organs, and these are varied. They include the heart, vessels, and even structures such as the kidney and lungs. But these, I would say, are the three major effector organs if we're thinking about the regulation of blood pressure. So let's take a look at some of these structures in a little bit more detail. So first of all, where is the carotid sinus? Well, the carotid sinus is found just about at this point here. It's where this vessel here, which is called the common carotid artery, splits into two. It splits into an internal carotid artery, which goes vertically up to the brain, and an external carotid artery, which supplies various structures in the face. And the carotid sinus sits on the internal carotid artery and is a little bulge there. it's actually not depicted all that well in this image. Now the carotid sinus sends a nerve up to the brainstem, and as we said before, this is the 9th cranial nerve, or the glossopharyngeal nerve. And this is the nerve that sends sensory information regarding the level of blood pressure to the medulla. Now, if we wish to mount a response to increased levels of blood pressure, we can do this using two different parts of the autonomic nervous system. Firstly, we can use a nerve here depicted in orange, and this is the vagus nerve. So the vagus is part of the parasympathetic nervous system. It emerges from the medulla and goes down to the heart and even down into the abdomen, where it can have effects on the gut. So in Latin, vagus means wanderer, and the vagus has many target tissues. But primarily from our point of view today, we're thinking about the vagus and its effect on the heart. So there's the vagus emerging from the brainstem, coming out through a hole in the skull, going down through the neck all the way to the heart. And then finally, we need to think about the sympathetic nerves. So these are the various sympathetics. And these are multiple. And their anatomy is a little more complex, but basically they are emerging from various levels of the spinal cord and synapsing on a number of different tissues. But the important one for the purposes of today's tutorial is that these sympathetics synapse directly upon arteries and arterioles and can exert their effect like that. So increased activity in the sympathetic nerves leads to contraction of the smooth muscle in the arterial media, causing contraction and decreased diameter. So now let's look at these in a little bit more detail as they emerge from the central nervous system. So here's a very quick cartoon drawing of the central nervous system. So I've drawn there the cerebral hemispheres. This is the spinal cord, and this is the brainstem that I've drawn there. So most of the reflex circuitry which we're talking about today can be found in the brainstem, which is between these two dashed red lines. And the brainstem is very closely involved in automatic control of physiological parameters, such as arterial blood pressure, breathing rate, kidney function, for example. The cerebral hemispheres, which are those folded portions at the top, are much more involved in conscious functions. So mostly cardiovascular reflexes are unconscious. We don't have to think about them. So let's draw on our green glossopharyngeal nerve, which is containing sensory information from the carotid sinus. So there's the carotid sinus. This is a sensory nerve. It goes up into the medulla. Okay, I've drawn this pseudo-unipolar sensory neuron there. And the faster the rate of action potentials in the carotid sinus nerve relates to a higher level of blood pressure. So there are many synapses in the brainstem, but an important one for you to think about is the synapse between the glossopharyngeal nerve in green and the vagus nerve in orange. Okay? So here's the vagus. It comes out of the brainstem as well and goes down to our various target tissues. So I'm just going to, for example, put the heart there as a target of the vagus. And you can see what I've drawn is that there is actually there's a synapse, an excitatory synapse, between, in this case, the glossopharyngeal nerve and the vagus nerve. And that makes sense, as we'll see later on, because if arterial blood pressure increases, we have an increased number of action potentials in the glossopharyngeal nerve. That in turn stimulates the parasympathetic vagus nerve, which slows the heart down. So that's a simple cardiovascular autonomic reflex. Now, in blue, what I've drawn here are the sympathetic nerves emerging from the different levels of the spinal cord. And they are in turn controlled by other neurons which have descended from the brainstem. And you can imagine that there might be inhibitory interneurons connecting, say, the glossopharyngeal nerve to the red neuron in this image, which will tend to inhibit the sympathetic system if blood pressure rises. Now, what we have primarily depicted here is an automatic system. I said earlier that there is very little input from the cortex, but there is some. So there are some neurons which project down from the cortex to the brainstem, and they can modulate these reflex pathways. And a classic example of this is what's known as white coat hypertension, which is where some patients, if they see a doctor, who might or might not be wearing a white coat, actually get an elevated blood pressure reading. And this is because their cerebral cortex has communicated with their brainstem and caused essentially a fight or flight response. So there are connections between the conscious cerebral cortex and the unconscious brainstem. So now let's talk through this slightly complicated diagram. We're going to start off right at the top, and we're considering the effect of a decrease in arterial blood pressure. And this could be caused by a whole host of factors, but a simple one to consider is the effect of hemorrhage, the effect of blood loss. So if you lose blood, your blood pressure will decrease. Now, if your arterial blood pressure decreases, this drop is detected by the baroreceptors in your carotid sinus. So the activity in the nerves supplying the baroreceptors decreases, thus informing the central nervous system, particularly the medulla, of a change. And the central nervous system is able to influence the various target tissues through the pathways that we discussed previously. And these influences are primarily through sympathetic nerves in red and parasympathetic nerves, particularly the vagus, in green. And let's consider these two different responses. Generally, after a drop in blood pressure, the sympathetic activity will increase, as shown by the red arrow, and the parasympathetic activity will decrease. So thinking about the effects of sympathetic activation first, one thing that we note is that the arterioles constrict. And constriction of arterioles leads to an increase in the amount of total peripheral resistance. So constriction of arterioles leads to increased total peripheral resistance. And if you remember the equation that we looked at earlier on, the arterial blood pressure is determined by cardiac output and total peripheral resistance. Increased resistance, increased arterial blood pressure. Now, not only do arterioles contract, but veins also constrict. Veins constrict, but in constricting the veins, we're not directly affecting the arterial blood pressure. But what we're actually doing is we are forcing blood out of the venous system and sending it back to the heart. And we're actually increasing the amount of blood that we're putting into the heart during diastole. So we are able to increase the end diastolic volume by constricting veins. And if you remember, a higher end diastolic volume will give us a higher stroke volume which will in turn give us a higher cardiac output. So increased stroke volume will give us, increased end-diastolic volume will give us increased stroke volume, which in turn will contribute to an increased cardiac output. But stroke volume is affected by other factors as well, and sympathetic activation also leads to an increase in the contractility of the heart, so how forcefully the heart muscle squeezes, and this in turn leads to an increased stroke volume as well. So we're increasing stroke volume from two different angles. We're increasing end-diastolic volume and we're increasing myocardial contractility, both of which are feeding into an increased cardiac output. But furthermore, sympathetic activation affects the heart in a different way. It increases its rate of contraction by affecting the sinoatrial node. So an increased heart rate is also going to occur, which is furthermore going to increase cardiac output even more. So you can see that in the sympathetic nervous system we've got a very effective response to increase cardiac output and therefore help to maintain arterial blood pressure if we lose blood. We also need to consider the parasympathetic nervous system response in green, and as we said earlier, those two systems, sympathetic and parasympathetic, tend to be antagonistic. So if we saw an increased level of activity in the sympathetic nervous system, we would predict a decreased level of activity in the parasympathetic nervous system. And that is indeed what we see. So the parasympathetics are less active, meaning that they tend to slow the heart rate down less. So there's less inhibition on the heart, meaning that it can increase its activity to maintain arterial blood pressure. So I hope that this mini tutorial was helpful. As always, I'd like to encourage you to leave some feedback so that I can try to make these as effective as possible for your learning. Okay, thank you, bye.